Genisa, Lisa.
Talafalava, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to first of all honour and acknowledge Jerry Collins, who had his funeral earlier on this morning in Porirua. I and a number of Labour MPs were there to celebrate his life. Manuia lo malanga, Jerry. Mr. Speaker, this government has failed to deliver on the brighter future that it has promised us. It promised us 7 years ago that it would deliver a budget surplus. We still haven't seen that. And it has lost its way, and it's stumbling from one disaster to another. It is dealing with incompetence now, Mr. Speaker. For instance, how it's dealing with the Crown land, with the Tamaki Collective and Ngāti Whātua in Auckland, how it's dealing with relationships Aotearoa, and Mr. Speaker, one of my very own constituents, 2-year-old Emilita Bourne, may she rest in peace, died last year in part due to the incompetence of this government. There are many examples where this government has lost its way and where it fails to prioritise what is actually important, which are New Zealand children and their families. This government has spent 11 million on sheep for a businessman in Saudi Arabia. It has spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on MB signs, on an MB rock, and we're here today on an MB desk. The government has wasted 26 million on the flag referendum, which a lot of people tell us they don't really want. It has not even passed the health and safety legislation, Mr. Speaker, after 29 New Zealanders had died at Pike River. And then there's the housing crisis, which brings me to where I would like to focus today, Mr. Speaker, which is on the tragic death of 2-year-old Emilita Bourne. The coroner in his report found that Emilita Bourne's death in Otara was partly as a result of the cold, the damp, the mouldy state house that she lived in. And Mr. Speaker, this is a damning indictment on this government. The State House did not even have any carpets. It was not insulated. And the state departments that the family dealt with were told many, many times of the ill health that this toddler was suffering from, as well as one of her siblings who was suffering from rheumatic fever. Mr. English stated that Housing New Zealand insulates all of its properties where practicable. The government needs to explain, I think, Mr. Speaker, to the Bourne family the reasons why it was not practicable to insulate the State House that the Bourne family lived in, why it was not practicable to move this family. They asked many times to be moved from this State House to another house where it would have been fit for them to live in. Why wasn't it practicable to move them until after the tragic death of this child? I went door knocking, Mr. Speaker, last week during recess, and I went door knocking including this particular street in Otara where Emilita Bourne had lived. And you know, I tell you, Mr. Speaker, it breaks my heart to see some of these state houses and some of the condition that some of these families are still living in. Some of them, Mr. Speaker, their houses are not insulated. It's actually colder inside of these houses than outside of the house. I spoke with some of the neighbours that lived next to Emilita Bourne who actually recall seeing this toddler, seeing how she used to play on the streets and how she used to play on the public park right next door to her house. Mr. Speaker, only a few days after Emilita Bourne's death, we were also informed of another a father of 6 that lived in Papakura, and his death was also, according to the coroner's report, because of the incompetence of this government and the condition of the State House that he lived in. And Mr. Speaker, I'd like to actually just point out to the quote from Honourable Nick Smith when he was interviewed on TV3 on Paul Henry's program. He's quoted after the death of Emilita Bourne as saying, I quote, "People dying from pneumonia in winter is not new. People have got unwell during winter, died from pneumonia and other illnesses for a very, very long time." Mr. Speaker, this is a very, very insensitive quote right after a death. The tragic death of Otara Emilita Bourne, as well as the father of 6, Mr. Torval, is indeed the fault of this government. And it should, Mr. Speaker, do all of that it can. The government has a moral obligation to do everything it can to stop its houses from contributing to the deaths of its tenants. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Yeah, just before I call a member, I am going to ask the Honourable Paula Bennett to speak just a little bit more quietly when other members are speaking, especially about serious topics. Thank you. Jonathan Young.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Sir, the